Hi everyone. So this is pretty amusing. I just streamed, and the stream has now been caught in processing. It seems permanently. I can't seem to win one with streaming from a laptop on a really crappy university connection. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read it again. I'm gonna read Chapter 7 again of Capitalist Realism. So here we go. This is going to be my Chapter 7 installment for my Acid Left collaboration. On the upside, because this is my second time doing it tonight, I'm hopefully going to pronounce things a bit better. Man. But hey, 2 times the charm? 3 times the charm? Is that how it is? I'm going to be able to spend some more time with Mark Fisher tonight. It's always a blessing. Although I won't lie, I'm a bit bitter. I'm a bit torn up because I think I did make some very insightful comments when I was doing my cross-reading with flatline constructs. So unfortunately, that's not going to be present in this video. I will probably re-record that and upload that at a later date for anyone who's interested. But for right now, it's just going to be Chapter 7. Grab your tea, grab your blanket, get cozy. This is the cozy corner after all, and saddle up for more very depressing theory. Okay. Capitalist Realism, Chapter 7. If you can watch the overlap of one reality with another, capitalist realism is dream work and memory disorder. Being realistic may have once meant coming to terms with a reality experienced as solid and immovable. Capitalist realism, however, entails subordinating oneself to a reality that is infinitely plastic, capable of reconfiguring itself at any moment. We are confronted with what Jameson, in his essay The Antimanes of the Postmodern, calls a purely fungible present in which space and psyches alike can be processed and remade at will. The reality here is akin to the multiplicity of options available on a digital document, where no decision is final. Revisions are always possible, and any previous moment can be recalled at any time. The middle manager I referred to above turned adaptation to this fungible reality into a fine art. He asserted with a full confidence a story about the college and its future one day, what the implications of the inspection were likely to be, what senior management was thinking, then literally the next day would be happily propound a story that directly contradicted what he had previously said. There was never a question of his repudiating the previous story. It was as if he only dimly remembered there ever being another story. This, I suppose, is good management. It is also, perhaps, the only way to stay healthy amidst capitalism's perpetual instability. On the face of it, this manager is a model of beaming mental health, his whole being radiating a hail fellow well met boheme. Such cheerfulness can only be maintained if one has a near total absence of any critical reflexivity, and a capacity, as he had, to cynically comply with every directive from bureaucratic authority. The cynicism of the compliance is essential, of course. The preservation of this 60s liberal self-image depended upon his not really believing in the auditing processes he so assiduously enforced. What this disavowal depends upon is the distinction between inner subjective attitude and outward behavior I discussed above. In terms of his inner subjective attitude, the manager is hostile and even contemptuous towards the bureaucratic procedures he supervises, but in terms of his outward behavior, he is perfectly compliant. Yet it is precisely workers' subjective disinvestment from auditing tasks which enables them to continue to perform labor that is pointless and demoralizing. The manager's capacity to smoothly migrate from one reality to another reminded me of nothing so much as Ursula Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven. It is a novel about George Orr, a man whose dreams literally come true. In time-honored fairy tale fashion, however, the acts of wish fulfillment quickly become traumatic and catastrophic. When, for instance, Orr is induced by his therapist, Dr. Haber, into dreaming that the problem of overpopulation is solved, he wakes to find himself in a world which billions have been wiped out by a plague. A plague that, as Jameson put it in his discussion of the novel, was a hitherto non-existent event which rapidly finds its place in our chronological memory of the recent past. The very recent past. Today is the recent past. Much of the power of the novel consists in its rendering of these retrospective confabulations whose mechanics are at once so familiar because we perform them every night when we dream, and so odd. How could it ever be possible for us to believe successive or even coextensive stories that so obviously contradict one another? Yet we know from Kant, Nietzsche, and psychoanalysis that waking, as much as dreaming experience, depends upon just such screening narratives. If the real is unbearable, any reality we construct must be a tissue of inconsistencies. What differentiates Kant, Nietzsche, and Freud from the tiresome cliché that life is but a dream is the sense that the confabulations we live are consensual. The idea that the world we experience is solipsistic delusion projected from the interior of our mind consoles rather than disturbs us, since it conforms with our infantile fantasies of omnipotence. But the thought that our so-called interiority owes its existence to a fictionalized consensus that will always carry an uncanny charge. This extra level of uncanniness is registered in The Lathe of Heaven when Le Guin has Orr's reality-warping dreams witnessed by others. The therapist, Haber, who seeks to manipulate and control Orr's ability, and the lawyer, Evan Leitch. What, then, is it like to live through someone else's dream coming true? What is it? Honestly, I feel like we're kind of living that right now. Ugh. This is someone's waking nightmare. Haber could not go on talking. He felt it, the shift, the arrival, the change. The woman felt it too. She looked frightened. Holding the brass necklace up close to her throat like a talisman, she was staring in dismay, shock, terror out of the window at the view. What would it do to the woman? Would she understand? Would she go mad? What would she do? Would she keep both memories, as he did, the true one and the new one, the old one and the true one? Does she go crazy? Go crazy. No, not at all. After a few moments of bewildered fugue, Heather Leitch accepts the new world as the true world, editing out the point of suture. The strategy of accepting the incommensurable and the senseless without question has always been the exemplary technique of sanity as such, but it has a special role to play in late capitalism, that motley painting of everything that ever was, whose dreaming up and junking of social fictions is nearly as rapid as its production and disposal of commodities. In these conditions of ontological proximity, forgetting becomes an adaptive strategy. Take the example of Gordon Brown, whose expedient reinvention of his political identity involved an attempt to induce a collective forgetting. Okay, I am not muted. In an article in International Socialism, John Neusinger remembers how Brown told the Confederation of British Industry Conference that business is in my blood. His mother had been a company director, and I was brought up in an atmosphere where I knew exactly what was happening as far as business was concerned. He was, indeed, he had always been, one of them. The only problem is that this wasn't true. As his mother subsequently admitted, she would never have called herself a businesswoman. She had only ever done some light administrative duties for a small family firm, and had given up the job when she married 3 years before young Gordon was even born. While there have been labor politicians who tried to invent working-class backgrounds for themselves before, Brown was the first to try and invent a capitalist background. Nusinger contrasts Brown with his rival and predecessor as British Prime Minister Tony Blair, a very different case. While Blair, who presented the strange spectacle of a postmodern messianism, never had any beliefs that he had to recant on, Brown's move from Presbyterian socialist to New Labour Supremo was a long, arduous, and painful process of repudiation and denial. Whereas for Blair, the embrace of neoliberalism involved no great personal struggle because he had no previous beliefs to dispose of. Nusinger writes, for Brown it involved a deliberate decision to change sides. The effort, one suspects, damaged his personality. Blair was the last man by nature and inclination. Brown has become the last man, the dwarf, the end of history, by force of will. Blair was the man without a chest, the outsider of the party needed in order to get into power. His joker, hysterical face, salesman smooth. Brown's implausible act of self-reinvention is what the party itself had to go through. His fake smile grimace, the objective correlative of labor's real state now that it has completely capitulated to capitalist realism. Gutted and gutless, its insides replaced by simulacra, which once looked lustrous but now possess all of the allure of decade-old computer technology. To me, those are still pretty alluring, but we get what he's saying here. In conditions where realities and identities are upgraded like software, it is not surprising that memory disorders should have become the focus of cultural anxiety. See, for instance, the Bourne films, Memento, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. In the Bourne films, Jason Bourne's quest to regain his identity goes alongside a continual flight from any settled sense of self. Try to understand me, says Bourne in the original novel by Robert Ludlum. I have to know how to change things. I have to know certain things, enough to make a decision, but maybe not everything. A part of me has to be able to walk away, to disappear. I have to be able to say to myself, what was isn't any longer, and there's a possibility that it never was because I have no memory of it. What a person can't remember didn't exist for him. In the films, Bourne's transnational nomadism is rendered in an ultra-fast cutting style which functions as a kind of anti-memory, pitching the viewer into the vertiginous, continuous present in which Jameson argues is characteristic of postmodern temporality. The complex plotting of Ludlum's novels is transformed into a series of evanescent event ciphers and action set pieces, which barely cohere into an intelligible narrative. Bereft of personal history, Bourne lacks narrative memory, but retains what we might call a formal memory. A memory of techniques, practices, actions that is literally embodied into a series of physical reflexes and tics. Here, Bourne's damaged memory echoes the postmodern nostalgia mode as described by Frederick Jameson, in which contemporary or even futuristic reference at the level of content, obscure reliance on established or antiquated models at the level of form. On the one hand, this is a culture that privileges only the present and the immediate. The extirpation of the long term extends backwards as well as forwards in time. For example, media stories monopolize attention for a week or so and then are instantly forgotten. On the other hand, it is a culture that is excessively nostalgic, given over to retrospection, incapable of generating any authentic novelty. It may be that Jameson's identification and analysis of this temporal antimony is his most important contribution to our understanding of postmodern/post-forwardist culture. The paradox from which we set forth, he argues in Antinomies of the Postmodern, is the equivalence between an unparalleled rate of change on all of the levels of social life and an unparalleled standardization of everything. Feelings along with consumer goods, language along with built space, that would seem incompatible with such mutability. What then dawns is the realization that no society has ever been as standardized as this one, and that is the stream of human, social, and historical temporality has never flowed quite so homogeneously. What we begin to feel, therefore, and what begins to emerge is some deeper and more fundamental constitution of postmodernity itself, at least in its temporal dimension, is henceforth where everything now submits to the perpetual change of fashion and media image, that nothing can change any longer. No doubt this is another example of the struggle between the forces of deterritorialization and re-territorialization, which Deleuze and Guattari argue is the constitutive of capitalism as such. It wouldn't be surprising if profound social and economic instability resulted in a craving for familiar cultural forms, which we return to in the same way that Bourne reverts to his core reflexes. The memory disorder that is the correlative of this situation is the condition which afflicts Leonard in Memento, thematically pure anti-retrograde amnesia. Here, memories prior to the onset of the condition are left intact, but sufferers are unable to transfer new memories into long-term memory. The new, therefore, looms up as hostile, fleeting, unnavigable, and the sufferer is drawn back to the security of the old. The inability to make new memories, a succinct formulation of the postmodern impasse. If memory disorder provides a compelling analogy for the glitches in capitalist realism, the model for its smooth functioning would be dream work. When we are dreaming, we forget, but we immediately forget that we have done so, since the gaps in the lacuna and our memories are photoshopped out, they do not trouble or torment us. What dream work does is to produce a confabulated consistency which covers over anomalies and contradictions, and it is this which Wendy Brown picked up on when she argued that it was precisely dream work which provided the best model for understanding contemporary forms of power. In her essay American Nightmare, Neoconservatism, Neoliberalism, and De-Democratization, Brown unpacked the alliance between neoconservatism and neoliberalism, which constituted American version of capitalist realism up into 2008. Hey, cat. My cat's playing. I stream right next to his play box, his toy box. Hey, kitty. What? Wanna hang out with me? Brown shows that neoliberalism and neoconservatism operated from premises which are not only inconsistent but directly contradictory. How, Brown asks, does a rationality that is expressly amoral at the level of both ends and means, neoliberalism, intersect with one that is expressly moral and regulatory, neoconservatism? How does a project that empties the world of meaning, that cheapens and deracinates life and openly exploits desire, intersect, one centered on fixing and enforcing meanings, conserving certain ways of life, and repressing and regulating desire? How does support for governance modeled on the firm and a normative social fabric of self-interest marry or jostle against support for a governance modeled on church authority and a normative social fabric of self-sacrifice and the long-term filial loyalty, the very fabric shredded by unbridled capitalism? But incoherence at the level of what Brown calls political rationality does nothing to prevent symbiosis at the level of political subjectivity, and although they proceeded from very different guiding assumptions, Brown argues that neoliberalism and neoconservatism worked together to undermine the public sphere and democracy, producing a governed citizen who looks to find solutions in products, not political processes. As Brown claims, the choosing subject and the governed subject are far from opposites. Frankfurt School intellectuals, and before them Plato, theorized the open compatibility between individual choice and political domination, and depicted democratic subjects who are available to political tyranny or authoritarianism precisely because they are absorbed in a province of choice and need satisfaction that they mistake for freedom. Extrapolating a little from Brown's arguments, we might hypothesize that what held the bizarre synthesis of neoconservatism and neoliberalism together was their shared objects of abomination, the so-called nanny state and its dependents. Despite evincing an anti-statist rhetoric, neoliberalism is in practice not opposed to the state per se. This is where I diverge from that. as the bank bailouts of 2008 demonstrated, but rather to particular uses of state funds. Meanwhile, neoconservatism's strong state was confined to military and police functions and defined itself against a welfare state held to undermine individual moral responsibility. And that was Chapter 7 of Capitalist Realism. And I think I'm feeling up to rereading this section I really wanted to get through from Flatline Constructs to do some cross-reading. And now that again, this is my second time doing it, I think I have some clarity on the underlying themes I was trying to bring out. And so some things I would advise, I'm sorry, my nose is really itchy very suddenly. So some themes I would kind of suggest potentially listening for, even though obviously this is a very different approach to cybernetics, metafiction, so on and so forth. Some themes to point to in this cross-reading from Flatline Constructs, from cybernetics, postmodernism, and fiction are themes of fiction. Themes of capitalist realism versus social realism, not the art movement. But I suppose the fictions of the state making itself through a capitalist mode. I'm suddenly really thirsty. Hold on one moment. Cat break. Come here. Ow. That's okay. Say hi, Augustus. Oh, I'm sorry, you're so grumpy. Oh. Do you like listening to my voice as I read to people on the internet? So, take 2. Flatline Construct. Oh my god. Augustus just knocked something off of my desk. Take 2. Flatline Constructs, Gothic Materialism, and Cybernetic Theory Fiction. Chapter 1, Section 2, Cybernetics, Postmodernism, Fiction. You gonna do that while I'm taking... Well... There you go. Okay. Gothic Materialism, first definition. Gothic materialism is equivalent to cybernetic realism. Written a few years ahead of key cyberpunk texts such as Blade Runner and Neuromancer, Baudrillard's 2 essays on science fiction, Simulacra and Science Fiction, and Crash are stunningly prescient in their recognition that the good old imaginary of science fiction is dead and something else is in the process of emerging, not only in fiction but in theory as well. The same wavering and indeterminate fate puts an end to science fiction, but also to theory as specific genres, as Baudrillard. The theme of the end of theory and in its absorption into a science fiction which is no longer one will be taken up more fully in Chapter 4, but for now we will concentrate on the collapse of science fiction. Cyberpunk conforms to Baudrillard's prophecies to such a degree that it threatens to go beyond them. This is more than a question of Neuromancer and other novels providing stunning examples of how we realize extrapolative science fiction can operate as a pre-configurative social theory, says Baudrillard. Although it certainly involves this, it is a matter of fictional concepts becoming what used to be called social facts, the most obvious example of this phenomenon being the migration of Gibson's cyberspace from fiction out into the post-social reality. Baudrillard's own examples of the new science fiction that is not one are Dick and Ballard, 2 influences Gibson has repeatedly acknowledged. It is precisely Ballard and Baudrillard's shared sense of immanence, their refusal, Jameson would want to say inability, to offer any kind of social criticism that makes both quintessentially postmodern in Jameson's terms. Unlike Baudrillard, for whom science fiction proper replaces the utopian as a mode, Jameson assumes that, in its more confident period, science fiction was very much in the business of dealing with utopia. According to Jameson, the critical examination of images of utopia in science fiction novels such as Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed meant that these fictions were capable of exercising political responsibility in a way that the new science fiction cannot. As we shall see, for the Jameson of the Seeds of Time, Blade Runner becomes a privileged example of this phenomenon because it apparently exemplifies all of the features of the old dystopian fiction, yet it is clearly not dystopian. Scornful of the aspirations of the leftist transformational project to which Jameson is still committed, Baudrillard is particularly delighted by Ballard's refusal of the binary function/dysfunction, by his complete abandonment of any moral or political/critical stance. For Baudrillard, the dream of transformation belongs to the productive Promethean era industrialism that cybernetics has terminated. Like cybernetics itself, the fictions characteristic of the new era are imminent and thus leave no room for any kind of imaginary transcendence. In what follows, the emphasis will be placed on cybernetics rather than postmodernism, in part because it will be argued that cybernetics plays a crucial role in the genealogical development of what has been called postmodern theory. In his somewhat pompous essay, Postmodern Dead End, Felix Guattari attributes all postmodern thought to the hastily developed and poorly mastered references made in the immediate post-war period to the new communications and computer technologies. Guattari, the secret link that binds these various doctrines stems, I believe, from a subterranean relationship marked by the reductionist conceptions conveyed immediately after the war by information theory and cybernetic research. That was Guattari. Whilst not wanting to be quite so peremptory as Guattari, it will be argued here that postmodernist theory, in particular that of Jameson and Baudrillard, is substantially given over to description of processes that are often explicitly identified as cybernetic. Briefly, the crucial insights of cybernetics as presented in Wiener's 1948 Cybernetics for the control and communication in the animal and the machine, and in the latter, the human use of human beings, concerned feedback, the property of being able to adjust future conduct by past performance, says Wiener. In the Second World War, Wiener had worked on anti-aircraft weaponry whose efficacy depended upon the ability of machines to record the performance and non-performance of their tasks. The study of feedback is immediately a study of control and communication. Control is distinguished from domination since it is eminent to the system. The machine corrects itself, and the self-correcting function depends upon communication inside the system and outside of it. Two types of feedback could be distinguished: negative feedback, which tends to maintain stability in a system, and which can be seen to be exemplified in the simple gadgets such as thermostats, and positive feedback, which is the tendency of a system to run out of control, as with any kind of vicious circle. Technology is therefore important to cybernetics, but it is not as a certain contemporary usage of the cyber prefix implies, its sole focus. Rather, technical machines are significant precisely because of their analysis, in the double sense of the analysis that can be made of them and the analysis they make possible. Demands that the distinction between human beings, animals, and machines be decoded. What Wiener characterizes as the Cartesian privileging of the human over the animal and of the organic over the inorganic is revealed by cybernetics, Wiener thinks, to be an arbitrary prejudice attributable ultimately to monotheistic theology. And this is, although Wiener is so key, and he is the guy who made this term, what I will kind of side comment here, verbally footnote is that that's what he attributes it to. That's what ultimately most theorists in cybernetic philosophy or cybernetic styles of thinking, that type of analysis, that type of postmodern analysis, kind of contributed to. That's not the case. Personally, I may do a video essay on my research and work at some point, but I disagree with that vociferously. Oh, hi, Kat. Oh, hi. I know, I'm not paying enough attention to you. But anyway, since all working systems can all be described abstractly in terms of particular feedback processes, input and output of information, cybernetics is able to develop what Wiener still has to think of as a functional analogy between humans and machines. Yet, as Baudrillard very quickly realized, this very functionality, or operationality as he calls it, means that the relation is always more than merely analogical. Evidently, and as Wiener himself has realized, the emergence of cybernetics was not only a matter of theory. The problem of unemployment arising from automation is no longer conjectural, but has become a very vital difficulty of modern society, says Wiener, as he notes in God and Golem, Inc. His speculations on the moral and theological implications of cybernetics as presented there and in the earlier human use of human beings are prompted by a sense that cybernetics has made a certain social and scientific impact, not only as a relatively new idea, but as a set of practices that are already mutating the social machines. Cybernetics provides the pretext for the mechanized control of social life and of the body itself, and all of it through the delicate nets of non-machine-derived mathematical formulae. Cicely Rone writes, summarizing a certain leftist social criticism's glum perception of cybernetics. Cybernetics represents the hardening and exteriorization of certain vital forms of knowledge, the crystallization of the Cartesian spirit into material objects and commodities. Cybernetics is already a paradox, simultaneously a sublime vision of human power over chance and a dreary augmentation of multinational capitalism's mechanical process of expansion, so far characterized by an almost uninterrupted positive feedback. Oh no, hold on one moment. That's no good. My computer's about to die. Boop. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, I lost my page there for a bit. Deleuze-Guattari, Baudrillard, and Jameson all recognize that capitalism, which has always functioned as an adaptive, self-compensating system, is becoming increasingly cybernetic. For Deleuze-Guattari, capitalism has entered a cybernetic and informational phase. Cross-reading. Beam. The older power regimes of mechanic enslavement, in which human beings function as parts of a social technical mega-machine, and social subjugation, in which human beings are subjected to the technical machines that they use, combined in a new aggregate which includes both subjection and enslavement taken to extremes as two simultaneous parts that constantly reinforce and nourish each other. A combination made possible, in part, by the emergence of cybernetic machines as computers. Elsewhere, Deleuze characterizes this formation as a control society and credits Burroughs with being its first cartographer. When, in the ecstasy of communication, Baudrillard announces the arrival of the protenic era of networks, the narcissistic and protean era of connections, contact and contiguity, feedback, and generalized interface that goes with the universe of communication. He is very obviously describing an era dominated by the same cybernetic and informational processes. From his first book, The System of Objects, through to For a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign, and on into his latest work, Baudrillard has been obsessed with cybernetics and its implications. And Scott Batek, I still can't get it. Scott Bacatman, tirelessly points out Baudrillard's subject is a terminal both at the end of an exhausted Western line and an input-output node on the network, a switching center for all of the networks of influence. Rather than criticizing this self-regulating, self-same, and self-reproducing system from the point of view of a utopia yet to come in the manner of a dialectical Marxism, Baudrillard simulates a primitive perspective comparing the dull white magic of humanist technoscience with the black magics of a symbolic exchange, broadly accepting the negative characterization of cybernetics outlined in leftist critique, but abandoning any sense that the tendency towards total cyberneticization could be overcome by a collective action of whatever form. Baudrillard suggests, not sure where that was coming from, suggests that resistance and criticism are superseded strategies which are easily fed back into the system. Okay. Which, anyway, requires them. Sorry about that. Battery notification. That's what I get for doing this twice. Cybernetic control, generation through models, differential modulation, feedback, question/answer, etc. This is the new operational configuration, says Baudrillard. The system doesn't work by suppression or repression, but through participative processes. An archetypal phenomenon is the opinion poll, which, according to Baudrillard, doesn't represent or even manipulate the public opinion, but substitutes for it. We live in a referendum mode precisely because there is no longer any referential cross-reading theme. As we shall see in Chapter 4 for Baudrillard, these fictions, which are by no means fictions in the old sense, stand for a social scene that has been thoroughly cybernetized. I study this. I should be able to get that. This is no longer a matter of feedback, but of simulation circuitries which have no referent beyond themselves. Public opinion is par excellence both the medium and the message, says Baudrillard. Continuing, the poles informing this opinion are the unceasing imposition of the medium as the message. They thereby belong to the same order of TV as the electronic media, which are also perpetual question/answer game, an instrument of perpetual polling. Baudrillard's description of these flattened-out feedback processes tends to not refer to Wiener, but to McLuhan himself, a theorist clearly strongly influenced by cybernetics, and to Monod, whose molecular cybernetics provides Baudrillard with much of the theoretical framework from which his notion of the code is produced. Yet Wiener appears to be a powerful, if uncredited, influence on Baudrillard, which it is. There is bits and pieces of the system of objects are they are transposed from Wiener's work. They really are. Obviously with a new tilt on them, a new context, given the age and I would suppose the term just frame, the industrial frame which Wiener was writing was specifically with God and Gollum was in the 60s. So there's going to be a difference there, but the influence is big. That is a genealogy there. One of the most celebrated aspects of Baudrillard's work, his Order of Simulacra, could almost be a gloss on Wiener's. Could be a gloss on Wiener. Or Wiener. Not only to do the order of simulacra culminate in cybernetics, simulacra of simulation founded on information, the model, a cybernetic game, total operationality, hyperreality, the aim of total control, says Baudrillard. It is the threefold distinction it relies upon itself seems to be derived from the typology of machines Wiener outlines in the first chapter of Cybernetics, arguing there that the ability of an artificer? I didn't trip up that one on my first go. To produce a working simulacrum of a living organism has always intrigued people, and claiming that the desire to produce and to study automata has always been expressed in terms of the living technique of the age. Wiener divides modern technology into three eras. In the time of Newton, the automaton becomes a clockwork music box with a little effigies pirouetting stiffly on top. Oh, by the way, Wiener doesn't get nearly as much credit. I wouldn't even say credit, just due diligence in postmodern cybernetic thought, or just studies of technocultures. I highly recommend you go back and read Human Use of Human Beings, God and Golem, Cybernetics, because they are just, not only are they very intellectually very revolutionary, even if I feel that there are obviously certain contextual limits, especially with regards to religion and I suppose the term would be the sacred android and so on and so forth, as a religion scholar. But they're just gorgeous prose. It's gorgeous prose. It's gold. Effigies pirouetting stiffly on top. In the 19th century, the automaton is a glorified heat engine burning some combustible fuel instead of the glycogen of the human muscles. Finally, the present automaton opens doors by means of photocells or points guns to the place at which a radar beam picks up an airplane or computes the solution of differential equations, says Wiener. The order of simulacra, as Baudrillard presents it, makes the same differentiation between mechanical, thermodynamic, and cybernetic machines, expressed initially as the distinction between the automaton, which for Baudrillard is understood as a purely mechanical being, and the robot, which is an industrial creature. A world separates these two beings. The automaton plays the man of the court, the socialite. It takes part in the social and theatrical drama of pre-revolutionary France. As for the robot, and this is all Baudrillard, as for the robot, as this name implies, it works. End of the theater, beginning of human mechanics. The automaton is the amalgam of man and remains responsive to him, even playing draughts with him. The machine is the equivalent of man, appropriating him to itself in the unity of a functional process. This sums up the difference between the first and second order simulacra. That was Baudrillard. The third order simulacra, or the information processing systems of late capitalism, which no longer constitute either transcendence or projection. They are models which are themselves in anticipation of the real, and thus leave no room for any kind of fictional anticipation. Theme. In Baudrillard's theory fictions of the three orders of simulacra must be taken seriously, which means, as realism about the hyperreal or cybernetic realism, is because they have realized that in capitalism, fiction is no longer merely representational, but has invaded the real to the point of constituting it. Any theory which thinks it can unmask the fictions of the capital belongs to the second order simulacra. The 19th century phase of industrial capitalism that was anyway always eluding it. Dressed up in the apparently cynical garb of ideology critique or the hermeneutics of suspicion, such theories nevertheless credulously assume a certain stock of reality that can be metaphorically, analyzed and distinguished from its supposedly merely phenomenal counterfeits, not grasping that, since industrialism, reality has been produced Baudrillard would want to say simulated, as artifice. It's artifice. Yet capitalism is the story of a successful implementation of a quantitatively increasing fiction, i.e. capital itself. What Deleuze-Guattari call fictional quantities absorb the socius into themselves in an irreversible process of artificialization, that happens at the level of the code, the very biological and socio-psychic formatting protocols from which all identity is produced. Exactly like the splicing between man, machine, and insect Cronenberg shows in his version of The Fly. The merging Baudrillard describes takes place at the molecular level, so that the distinguishing between so-called natural from the artificial is radically impossible. In the cybernetic age of anticipative simulacra, fiction, to paraphrase Deleuze-Guattari, is not an image of the world. It forms a rhizome with the world. There is an aparallel evolution of the world. Sounds a bit like dream work. There's an aparallel evolution of fiction in the world. The empirical, as such, is increasingly the mere playing out of what has already happened virtually in a simulation. Baudrillard is fascinated by this immanentization, but typically tends to recode it, as in his essay Crash, in semiurgic and nostalgic terms. What Ballard points to in Crash, Baudrillard thinks, is the limit point of the hyper-rational, the point at which the system compensates in favor not of capitalist demystification, but symbolic exchange, reverting back to the primitive rituals whose excision from hyper-capitalism Baudrillard is always lamenting, accepting and perpetuating the Weber-Bataille narrative of rationalist disenchantment. Baudrillard sees only fleetingly what is evident to Wiener and Gibson, the convergence of cybernetics and sorcery on the Gothic flatline. And that was Cybernetics, Postmodernism, and Fiction from Mark Fisher's Flatline Constructs. And I really do hope that my intermittently not so subtle wielding of capitalist realism kind of pointed to some of the, what would I say, meta themes, I suppose, I was trying to point to in tying these two readings together. But anyway, if you are here for the Acid Left public reading for capitalist realism, I do hope that this was helpful to you and that you enjoyed it. And I hope some of, again, those very not so subtle themes, not so subtle to the way I pointed them out, rather, themes provide, what's the term? Salient points of discussion? Anyway, apologies if you're seeing notifications for this video twice, because, like I said earlier, this is my second recording of it. Thank you for hanging out with me. I thank you for chilling with me and diving into Mark Fisher's vision of capitalism and fictions. And, oh, he's asleep. Thank you for putting up with, not putting up with, he's a pleasure, he's a joy. Thank you for entertaining brief visions of my cat, Augustus. Anyway, let's see if I can get tonight's sign off in one take. All right. Signing off from your hardcore anarchist, cybernetic dreamworker, technocultural spiritualist, gothic materialist, doomer GF. Stay safe? Is that how it normally goes? Signing off. Take care.